At 92 years old, Willie Nelson no longer hides behind the jokes, the braids, or the outlaw legend the world created for him. When he talks now, it's stripped of pretense. No clever lines, no rehearsed wisdom. Just a man at the end of a very long road, finally admitting something he's been running from his entire life. For decades, he fought for breath, for family, for redemption, for a song worth singing. But lately his voice trembles for a different reason. Friends say he's calm now, almost too calm, as if he's already made peace with something the rest of us are still afraid to name. What could make a man who survived fire, heartbreak, and death itself finally say he's ready for it all to end? The boy who learned to breathe through pain. Willie Hugh Nelson was born on April 29, 1933, in the small farming town of Abbott, Texas, during the darkest years of the Great Depression. Poverty wasn't an experience. It was the air he breathed. His parents, Ira and Mael Nelson, were young, poor, and desperate to survive. His mother left when he was still a baby, promising to come back once life got better. His father remarried and disappeared soon after. That promise never came true. By age 6, Willie and his sister Bobby were orphans in everything but name, raised by their grandparents, poor farmers who believed that hard work and hymns were enough to keep a child alive. It was his grandfather, a blacksmith with hands that smelled of iron and fire, who gave him his first guitar. The strings were too big for his fingers, but the sound, rough, unpolished, human, filled the silence that had been eating him alive since his parents left. When pneumonia took his grandfather away, Willie sat beside the bed counting the spaces between each breath, terrified that if he stopped counting, the world would stop too. That sound, the crackle of lungs fighting for air, would follow him for the rest of his life. By 7, he was working in cotton fields under the Texas sun, his hands raw and bleeding, his back bent before it finished growing. Every night, he'd lie awake, coughing from dust, humming little melodies he didn't know were songs yet. Music became his way of breathing. When his fingers touched the strings, the silence didn't hurt as much. The applause didn't matter. What mattered was that someone was listening. Willie once said, "I filled the silence with songs because no one else was talking to me." That silence turned into his first teacher. It taught him endurance, humility, and a strange kind of peace. The knowledge that pain doesn't always need to be conquered. Sometimes you just learn to live with it. And for Willie Nelson, that lesson would define everything that came after. The way he loved, the way he lost, and eventually, the way he would face death itself. The road, the fire, and the fall. By the time Willie Nelson turned 20, survival had already replaced hope as his daily goal. He drifted from one small job to another, trimming trees, patching saddles, selling encyclopedias door to door. Each rejection, each unpaid bill, became another verse in the unfinished song of his life. Nashville was supposed to be his salvation. Instead, it became another wall. Record executives told him his voice was too nasal, his look too plain, his songs too strange. But those songs, Funny How Time Slips Away, Nightlife, Crazy, carried more truth than anything they'd ever heard. He sold them for a few $100s each just to keep food on the table. Other singers made them hits. Willie made them history. But he didn't see the money, only the lesson. The world doesn't reward honesty until you're too broke to need it. In the 1960s, his luck seemed to shift. He found love again, or what felt like it, with his first wife, Martha Matthews. They had 3 children, Lana, Susie, and Billy, and a small home in Fort Worth. To outsiders, they looked like a family chasing a dream. Inside, the walls echoed with arguments, unpaid bills, and guilt. Willie played in bars until dawn while Martha waited, half asleep and half angry, surrounded by children who didn't understand why Daddy always had to leave. One night, during a drunken fight, he threw her into a river. He jumped in after her seconds later, terrified at what he'd almost done. He would never forget it. Decades later, he called that moment the lowest point of his life. Proof that even love can turn violent when despair becomes stronger than reason. The marriage didn't survive, and neither did his faith in stability. He remarried, divorced again, and by 1970, his house in Ridgetop, Tennessee burned to the ground, taking with it every song, draft, recording, and photograph he'd saved from his early years. He stood in the ashes, 40 years old, broke, divorced, and nearly finished. For a man who had spent his life trying to outrun silence, he found himself surrounded by it again. Nashville had rejected him. The money was gone. His faith in himself was gone. So he did what he'd always done. He packed his guitar and left. He drove back to Texas, where the air was harsh but honest, and started over. In Austin, the rules didn't matter. Cowboys played beside hippies, preachers beside drunks, and Willie, the failed Nashville songwriter, finally found a home for his truth. When he recorded Shotgun Willie in 1973, the record executives called it unmarketable. The people called it gospel. 2 years later, Red-Headed Stranger turned him from an outcast into a legend. But fame didn't heal him. It just changed the shape of his exhaustion. The applause replaced the silence, but it never replaced the ache. By the end of the 1970s, Willie Nelson had become the face of outlaw country, free, fearless, untamed. Yet behind the freedom was the same fragile man who had once watched his grandfather struggle for air. He'd traded cotton fields for concert halls, but the weight in his chest had never really left. The world finally heard his music, but they never really heard the man. The son he couldn't save. By the 1980s, Willie Nelson had everything success could offer: platinum records, sold-out tours, and a reputation as the man who had rewritten the rules of country music. But what fame gave him in applause, it took back in silence. The road was endless, the nights long, and the weight of his past kept following him from stage to stage. His voice, once his escape, had become his burden. The applause was louder, but the loneliness was deeper, and no amount of music could prepare him for what came next. The kind of pain that doesn't make you stronger, only smaller. On Christmas Day, 1991, Willie's world collapsed. That morning, the Nelson family should have been celebrating. Instead, the phone rang with a call no parent should ever hear. His eldest son, Billy Nelson, had taken his own life. He was just 33 years old. Billy had inherited his father's talent and his demons. He'd spent years trying to live up to a name that belonged more to the public than to the man who gave it to him. Depression had swallowed him whole, even as he tried to find meaning through music. Just days before his death, father and son had planned to record a gospel album together, a project meant to heal old wounds. Instead, it became a eulogy. Willie was shattered. He'd survived fire, heartbreak, and poverty, but this was different. There was no one to blame, no lesson to find, no song to write that could make it right again. His sister Bobby said he went quiet, not the kind of silence that comes from peace, but the kind that follows a scream. For months, he barely spoke. He sat alone on his ranch, staring into the open fields, replaying every missed call, every night he'd chosen the stage over home. "There are no songs for a pain like that," he later admitted. "No melody deep enough to carry it." When he finally returned to touring, fans noticed something different. The songs were slower, the space between words longer. When he sang Always on My Mind, people wept, not because of the melody, but because of what they could feel inside his voice, the sorrow of a father who would never stop apologizing. Willie once said, "I've lost a lot, but losing Billy was the only thing that ever broke me completely." But as if grief wasn't enough, another storm was already building behind the scenes. While he was mourning his son, the IRS came knocking, and this time, they didn't come with sympathy. They came with numbers. In 1990, the government seized his properties for $32 million in unpaid taxes, a fortune lost to years of bad management and misplaced trust. They took his ranch, his studio, even his gold records. Willie refused to declare bankruptcy. He said he couldn't sleep knowing he'd left honest people unpaid. Instead, he recorded the IRS tapes. "Who'll buy my memories?" and sent the profits directly to the government. For years, he toured non-stop, singing through grief and humiliation, paying off debts dollar by dollar. He'd lost his home, his son, and his faith in fairness, but he never lost his will. "The IRS took my stuff," he joked later, "but they couldn't take my soul." Beneath the humor, the truth was darker. Those years taught him what death really means. Not a single moment, but a slow process of losing everything that ever mattered, one piece at a time. One piece, the long battle for breath. As the 21st century unfolded, Willie Nelson's battle was no longer with fame, fortune, or failure. It was with his own body. The man who had outlived trends, rivals, and heartbreak was now fighting for something far more fragile: breath. His lungs, the same ones that had carried his voice across 1,000 stages, began to betray him. The years of cigarettes and smoke, of whiskey-fueled nights and constant touring, had finally taken their toll. It started quietly, a cough that never went away, a wheeze after every encore. By 2015, the damage could no longer be ignored. Doctors diagnosed him with emphysema and warned that without drastic measures, his singing days were over. For a man whose entire existence was built around music, it felt like a death sentence. He underwent an experimental stem cell treatment to repair the scar tissue in his lungs. It was painful, uncertain, and forced him off the road for months, time he wasn't used to spending in silence. Friends said that during recovery, Willie changed. He stopped running from the truth he'd been dodging for decades. He began speaking more openly about death, not as tragedy, but as a kind of release. "I don't fear it," he told the Associated Press in 2019. "I've lived long enough to know it's coming, and that's fine." His words weren't bravado, they were surrender. The calm acceptance of a man who had already watched too many people he loved fade away. COVID-19 nearly took him in 2022. At 90, with damaged lungs, it was a fight he wasn't expected to win. When he woke up gasping for air in the middle of the night, his wife Annie thought it was the end. She brought in doctors, treatments, machines, anything to keep him alive. For days, he hovered between life and death, his breath shallow, his voice gone. But somehow, he pulled through. When he spoke again, it wasn't about fear, it was about peace. "I've been close enough to dying," he said softly, "to know it ain't something to be scared of." Those who know him say that experience changed everything. He became quieter, more reflective. He started measuring time not by albums or tours, but by mornings. If he could wake up and still see the Texas sunrise from his porch, that was enough. He no longer cared about charts or headlines. His only goal was to keep breathing long enough to say goodbye properly, not to life, but to the people who gave it meaning. And as he grew older, the air itself became symbolic. Breath, for Willie Nelson, was no longer just life. It was memory. Every inhalation carried the scent of Abbott, Texas. Every exhale, the ghosts of the friends he'd buried along the way. To most people, dying is the end. To Willie, it's just another way of breathing. One last song sung in silence. The Last Highwayman. By 2024, Willie Nelson had outlived almost everyone who once stood beside him. Johnny Cash was gone. Waylon Jennings was gone. Chris Christopherson, the poet who once called Willie his brother in song, passed that September at 88. And just like that, the Highwaymen, the outlaws who had rewritten American music, were down to one. The last voice still standing, trembling but unbroken, belonged to the red-headed stranger from Abbott, Texas. He didn't call it loneliness. He called it the quiet. But those who knew him could see how it haunted him. Every time he picked up his guitar, he was playing for ghosts. For Billy, his son, for Bobby, his sister and First Harmony, for Waylon, Johnny, and Chris, the men who had turned rebellion into brotherhood. When he walked on stage now, he didn't see fans. He saw memories. The crowds cheered, but he looked just past them, into a space only he could feel, the space where his friends used to stand. That year, he released The Border and The Last Leaf on the Tree, two albums that sounded more like confessions than collections. They were stripped, aching, honest, songs about mortality, legacy, and the strange comfort of knowing the road ahead is short. He sang them not as a farewell, but as a prayer. "I've made peace with the idea," he said in an interview. "I've had more good days than bad ones. And when it's time, it's time." Yet even with death hovering nearby, Willie refused to stop. In 2025, he joined Bob Dylan for the Outlaw Music Festival. 35 cities, thousands of miles, one more defiant run. He sang slower, softer, but still with the same fire that had carried him since childhood. Each concert felt like a goodbye that never quite said the words. Fans waited for an announcement, some grand finale, but it never came. On the final night in St. Louis, as the lights dimmed, Willie simply smiled and said, "I'll see you down the road." No speeches, no tears, just the truth. Now, at 92, Willie lives quietly at his Luck Ranch in Spicewood, Texas. 700 acres of peace, horses, and sky. He still wakes up early, drinks black coffee, practices yoga, and tends to his garden. His wife Annie, his companion through 3 decades of storms, sits beside him every morning on the porch. The air is cleaner there, easier to breathe. He doesn't need applause anymore. The world has already heard his voice. What matters now is stillness, the slow rhythm of wind through cedar trees, the faint echo of a guitar, and the realization that even legends eventually run out of time. When asked recently what scares him most about dying, Willie smiled and said, "Nothing. I've already seen what it looks like. I've said goodbye to everyone I ever loved. I just hope they're waiting when I get there." And that is the real reason he's ready for it to end. Not because he's tired of life, but because he's finally made peace with leaving it. For Willie Nelson, death isn't an ending. It's a reunion, the final verse in a song that began nearly a century ago in a small Texas town, when a boy first picked up a guitar and tried to turn silence into sound. Willie Nelson has faced every kind of loss, family, fortune, friends, even his own health, and still found the courage to keep singing. But now, at 92, he's no longer fighting the silence. He's learning to rest in it. Do you think Willie's acceptance of death is peace or heartbreak? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about the legends who shaped our world.